Hello and welcome to Crossover. I'm your host, Tegan Cantrell, an intern here at Lowell Telemedia Center. Today we'll be talking about immigration and the crossover between it, the subject of history, and the subject of philosophy. My two guests are Dr. Mendoza and Dr. Forrant in the philosophy and history departments at UMass Lowell. Dr. Mendoza, can you tell us a little about what you're doing in the philosophy department right now?
Sure. I just finished my book, a little shameless plug for that. And in the book, I tried to argue that a lot of the debates that we have over immigration are really debates over different philosophies. So the idea being that we can come up with all these sorts of facts, and they're important, they do matter. But how we interpret those facts and how we mobilize these facts tell us a lot about our philosophy. And so there's a way both that philosophy can help inform the immigration debate, but also the immigration debate, I think, challenges a lot of the moral and political assumptions that philosophers have had, different views on liberalism and republicanism and so forth. And that's kind of what I'm continuing on these days.
Wonderful. And Dr. Forrant, can you tell us a little about what you're doing in the history department?
Related to immigration history, I've been spending the last several months reading oral histories at the Center for Lowell History, which is part of the UMass Lowell library system. When the National Park came in, and with the center as well, in the 70s and early 80s, a tremendous number of oral histories were done with lots of immigrants who had come in the early 20th century and were now getting up there in age to try to get their stories down, both in a recording and then a transcription. And so I've been reading those to try to figure out how the actual recollections, memories, stories that people told in these oral histories sync up with the more narrative history that people just assume is the history of immigration. So try to figure out how do I, as a historian, do justice to the voice of the people whose stories I'm trying to tell. I find it difficult to do that if I'm actually not trying to get into the heads of those folks. And so that's really what I've been doing since probably late August, early September.
Fascinating. So what I want to do now is kick off the discussion with a little bit of groundwork by asking you both similar questions, but I want your takes on it from the philosophical perspective and from the historical perspective. I'd like to start with, what is citizenship? So like philosophically, can we answer that question like semantically or metaphysically? What is citizenship?
Well, citizenship, depending on, and this is where philosophy and maybe political theory kind of overlap a little bit. I would say citizenship, depending on how you want to look at it, provides you a couple different things. One is protections. To be a citizen means you have some sort of government or regime that is willing to protect what we now call rights, will protect your rights. The other thing is being a citizen allows you to participate in the making of this regime. So you can vote, for example, you have some sort of say. So citizenship gives you both protection and participation. But the sort of civic republican or ancient republicanism account of citizenship also thinks that you have obligations. So it's not just enough to have these protections and to participate, but that you also have to develop a kind of civic virtue. So you participate in making this political. It's not just that you can participate, but that you ought to, and there's certain responsibilities to it. And with an issue like immigration, it's interesting because you might have folks who come and become part of the community, participate in the community, and a lot of folks would say, well, just you coming and participating should grant you citizenship, because it's not just about giving you these protections and this ability to be able to vote, but the fact that you contribute to the community gives you a kind of cultural or community citizenship. And so it's a very debated topic, and it depends on which one of these sort of three things you want to focus on, where you might get a different kind of definition of citizenship. And
I'm sure you can get into more like gray area about that, for instance, like, well, how much participation are we going to call, stuff like that?
Exactly. So one thing is, well, some folks say, well, if you have this much participation, you're definitely a citizen. But how much participation? And then it starts getting tricky because, well, what if you were born in Lowell to parents who were born and raised in Lowell? You were automatically granted a kind of citizenship in Lowell, if you think of it as a kind of citizenship. But you just got that by birth. You didn't do anything. right? So notice you can be born into citizenship, which is basically nothing. You're just born and you're given citizenship, and yet you can have all these other folks who do a lot for the community, and maybe they don't count as citizens, and so it gets really tricky, right? You're asking the right question. Well, how much should we have? And it seems that for most of us, at least for me, I did nothing to earn my U.S. citizenship. I was born in the United States, and boom, I get a birth certificate, and now I'm a citizen, and I hold a passport that is coveted all around the world, and I did nothing.
Big questions. And now, Dr. Forrant, can you answer the same question, or rather, what has citizenship been historically? Like, what is citizenship according to like what it has actually been in history, regardless of abstractions or rationalizations? Which I'm not saying what you were saying was, but we can have abstract ideas of citizenship or rational ideas of citizenship, but empirically and historically, what is citizenship?
So in the founding of the Republic of the United States of America, one nation under God, all that good stuff, citizenship was defined in the Constitution. And citizenship, for me at least, the way I think about American history, has been as much about who's included and who's excluded. So in the early days of the Republic, African Africans who had been brought here as enslaved people, for example, were not considered citizens. It took a civil war and constitutional amendment to sort of change those definitions and create this category where, again, theoretically, if you were descendants of African enslaved people, but then you were born here, you became a citizen, and as well, if you had been here when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, you were now freed, you had voting rights and citizenship rights and due process under the law. In terms of immigrants and immigration, American history is pretty vague in the 19th century about defining the rules about who can come in, who can't come in, what it means when you get here in terms of can you vote or not vote. It's only quite a bit later into the 19th century that we formalize things a bit more, that we have regulations. People sometimes think that Ellis Island always existed and you had to come through Ellis Island always when you got here, which was never the case. Lots of people came to Lowell by walking from Canada down into Lowell, and then just as was just described, they're here, they're in Lowell, and after a period of time, they get to vote and they get to participate in the process. More recently, because of the fact that so many people from around the world think about coming to the United States, if it's possible for them to do so, you see these very elaborate citizenship processes where people go through citizenship classes, apply for citizenship, and then just recently, earlier this year, there was a massive ceremony downtown at the Lowell Memorial Auditorium where hundreds of people, raised their right hand, swore to the Constitution, and became citizens of the United States. And I went to that ceremony because a bunch of my students were getting that citizenship bestowed upon them that day, and they invited me to come, and I thought, I gotta go. If they're reaching out to me like that, then I need to go and I need to see it. I had never been to such a ceremony, and so that was a completely different relationship that, and the lines of people that were outside, a nosy sort that I am, I sort of stayed outside for a while and talked to people in the line, asked them where they were from and what, if they wanted to tell me a little bit more about why they were doing what they were doing. And to them, citizenship has a completely different meaning and a deeper, more personal one in terms of them. Most of them remarked that now that they had this, they felt safe. That was something repeated over and over again. Safe in the sense that they didn't have to worry about somebody knocking on their door and kicking them out in the current political climate.
Like people who represent the government?
Yes.
Like ICE or the police?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that sets up a good idea of what we mean when we say citizenship. I got another one, though. What is a nation, philosophically?
That's another great question. I think Professor Forrant could say more about this. I mean, historically, right, that means a people. Mm-hmm. A nation is a people. one of the most famous immigrant philosophers is Aristotle. Aristotle did not have Athenian citizenship, even though he lived in Athens for a majority of his life. But even though he wasn't an Athenian citizen, because there you had city-states as opposed to nation-states. Now we have nation-states as opposed to city-states. He was not a citizen of Athens. He was still considered Greek. So he was considered part of the Greek nation. So nation-states and nations are related, but they're two different things. But a nation is usually thought of as a people, and we've, especially after the, I'm getting into a terrain here, it's more historical, the Treaty of Westphalia, we've thought of nations as having a particular kind of territory. And so now when we conflate the two, we sort of think of a state as a nation and having a particular kind of territory. So we think of a German national or French national, and there's something Frenchness that's related to the territory and to the people and to that particular part of the globe. And what's interesting about thinking of a nation in a place like the United States is, well, what is the people when it comes to the United States? Who gets to count as the people? And there I worry a lot, because there you can have these nefarious things like race and ethnocentrism and so forth kind of sneak in. When you define the nation in a certain way, who are you excluding? And so the two terms I think that you pointed out are very much related to each other, which is who gets to be a citizen? Well, a citizen is someone who's part of the people, the nation. Well, who is the nation? Well, the nation, and then you fill in whatever definition you want. And whether, it's true or not, certain people get to count as real nationals, and other people, well, we don't know, right? And it tends to be people of color. And you look at some of the attacks on Barack Obama early on, right? Well, is he really a national? Is he really a citizen of the United States? Which you don't get, which you never got with people like John McCain, even though John McCain was born in Panama. And I mentioned John McCain because Obama and McCain were running at the same time in 2008. Yeah. And, McCain was the one who was not born on U.S. soil. And yet, like as we said, as I mentioned before, the nation's usually thought of as being part of the territory. Right, and so here's Obama, who was born in the territory.
Or the people, like
the people,
McCain
the
would
people,
be seen as a member of the American people, regardless of where he was born, because of other things.
That's correct, and that's exactly right. So what makes you part of the people? Is it really your connection to territory? Well, it's because McCain is part of the people, and someone like Obama is always constantly under suspicion of.
So you're saying it's more complicated than where you were born, or where you live, or who your parents were. It's kind of like a mix of, like, there are a bunch of things that sort of make it up. And if you've got like most of them, then basically you count.
And it's also
if you have most of them, then you're white.
And it's an
that's a big one.
It's an imaginary that we have. We have this imagination of what, and it constantly changes. It's never totally fixed, and so we're always struggling. Who counts to be an American? For a long time, being Italian, being Irish, being Polish did not count as being part of the American nation. But then things have changed. Now it's if you're Latino, if you're Muslim. Well, maybe you're not really part of the nation. You're here, you might have citizenship, but maybe you're not really part of the nation. You're constantly suspected.
Constantly the other.
You're constantly other. And this is another way of othering folks, which is not unrelated to racism, but xenophobia is definitely, at the very least, a close cousin, if not the two. The two of it's complicated to separate the two out. But you see these two ways of othering people throughout history, and it's based on, well, who's really part of the nation.
So let's turn it over to Dr. Forrant. What historically has been a nation? Maybe mention nationalism? Got any thoughts about that?
So again, I think we agree, we just use different terminology, but for me, thinking about U.S. history, we're a set of colonies at the outset. We're, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Virginia Commonwealth, the this or that, the other thing, that through the process of the 18th century gets crafted together to end up having a revolution, kicking the British out, and now we redefine ourselves as the 13 original states, right, from the colonies to the states. The point being, it's a social construct. It's not like something where on the various plots of land, if you look at a map of Europe or Africa or South America or Central America or whatever, that somehow it was preordained that this is Brazil, this is the United States, this is Canada. They come about through war, they come about through conquest. certainly the growth in the development of the United States as a nation comes with its seeming never-ending capacity to want to take over places and push people aside or relegate people on a given plot of land to some inferior status while we sort of move in. Of course, Native Americans being a large group as well, but in the 1840s we have a war with Mexico, and then all of a sudden the complete boundary of what had one time been defined as Mexico, a huge swath of that now becomes part of the territory that's going to eventually become the Southwest and those states. And so it's a historical structure, the same as in Europe, right? I mean, the European wars and revolutions in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries are all about, you know, borders and whatever, like where's the resources, where's the this, where's the that. So it's not, I don't think of these things as like sort of like down from wherever, like predetermined, this is the map of the United States. If you look at the same way with Lowell, I mean, Lowell's not here, right? So if we think of the city of Lowell and its territorial boundary, Lowell is really made up of like places that were here before, Chelmsford and Draycott and other places that were here, and then a bunch of rich guys came and wanted to build a bunch of mills in Lowell, so they basically took a bunch of land from these other communities and called it Lowell. It's a construct. Again, it's not, in the history books, it's not as though the maps are the maps, right? And I think that is for me at least, when I'm teaching, I want to get that point across. These things are not. So like an argument today from a philosophical or historical point about a border and a fence or a wall, whatever it would be, those are constructs. It's not as though, again, these things were preordained, predetermined. This is, if you're over here, you're this, and if you're over here, you're that. And again, in terms of American history, US history, we've also chosen, we being the federal government, to, even though within the construct people are born, so take Japanese during the Second World War, Japanese citizens who are born here or American citizens, Japanese Americans, in the Second World War are stripped of their ability to own their businesses, their land, their homes, and put in internment camps without any due process of law, which theoretically citizenship says they're supposed to have. So even though then these things exist on parchment or whatever, they're still going to be violated when it serves somebody more powerful's interest to violate them. And that's, again, sort of that's the conflict part of the history that I can't escape from when I'm teaching.
So following up on this idea of a nation and citizenship, we've talked about a few other vocab words. There's a lot of overlap, clearly. Do you think that these ideas are like abstractly distinct from each other, or is there like that overlap for some more fundamental reason? Like maybe there's some bigger idea that you can't get around by talking about one specific thing? Or do you think people tend to conflate ideas that shouldn't be conflated to the point that it muddies the water and it makes it harder to have conversations about this, and it makes it easier to take advantage of that confusion?
Well, I think the second thing you said happens a lot. So I think as a philosopher, what makes things hard to have a debate about is when the concepts and the terms that we're using aren't very clear, and so we can kind of interchange them and make things really muddy and equivocate and so forth. So I think that happens. I also think that at least with an issue like immigration, it's hard not to have a historical component to it to talk about it philosophically, because history could have gone differently. You know, we could have historically had a globe where it's not an issue. You just belong to wherever you're living. We've always had, imagine a history where there was just open borders. A question of immigration would never arise. A question like immigration or any other sort of political or moral issue arises because of its historical context. For a long time, people didn't talk about human rights because that historically was not something that was really coming up. It comes up later on because of liberalism and so forth, and the struggles with monarchy and so forth. So I think there's definitely a historical element to the sorts of things we're going to debate in philosophy. But But even giving credence to the historical aspect, I think either because we just confuse our terms or for more nefarious reasons, people like to muddy the water. But I think, so I guess what I'm saying is I think for a philosopher it's important to have historical context, but just having historical context doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're going to have a very clear debate about any sort of issue. I don't know, what do you think about
Thoughts?
this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that over time, at different points in, again, speaking to what I know best, which is American history, in various points in time, questions of immigration and immigrant status and such became hot-button political issues for other reasons than the actual reason that people are trying to understand and figure out what immigration is and what it means. And so in the late 19th century, if you lived in, in the early 19th century, if you lived in Lowell and you were Irish, you were discriminated against and you were thought of as lesser than the other people who were here and running the city of Lowell. Later in the 19th century, when it served people better, the Irish are now going to do the same thing toward French Canadians. Then the next group coming along. And so from a historical standpoint, again, why all the terms to me are very slippery, we define and redefine what we mean by who's a citizen, who's a good immigrant or a bad immigrant. We also talk about that, like there are certain countries where people are good immigrants and there are other countries where people are not so good immigrants. So we want to let in the good immigrants, sort of like President Trump not too long ago talked about he wished we could get more immigrants from Norway and Denmark. You know, two very white, very snowy places, right? He didn't say from Honduras and Costa Rica. Gee, I wonder why, right? And so all of this is part of the equation, I think. And when we don't understand the history well, when we're misinformed or intentionally uninformed about Lowell's immigration history, let's say again as a specific case in point, we tend to botch up having any kind of a conversation that could, in a meaningful way, move us forward in this whole political debate that we're having right now. And so we're, vocabulary-wise, we're like ships in the night, where some people are talking in one way about immigrants and immigration and the contributions of immigrants to American society and culture and history and science and letters and all the rest of it, and other people who just see nothing but bad, right? And we've created this conversation where we've boxed ourselves in to these things being too stark on one side or the other, when in fact, you know, if we could all sit down and have a conversation, we could probably move a lot of people forward.
Yeah, it sounds like basically as humans we've kind of stumbled into a situation where we have these ideas, but we haven't really thought about why or what that means, and that we're like we tend to rationalize a lot to the ends that, you know, like our logic suits, you know, making us feel better about the things that we're doing to other people because it's convenient. So of course these discussions could be confusing because in the end we don't really have a really good handle on what all this stuff is until we start talking to the philosophers and they say, hey, this is what you're doing. Does it make any sense? And that's where that's what I'm getting from this. But the next idea I want to talk about is what's a border? So philosophically, what is a border?
Well, border is the thing that separates two things. What's interesting in the immigration debate is there's a lot of reasons to oppose what Trump is proposing, you know, build a wall and so forth for moral reasons, all kinds of reasons. But what's also interesting is it just sort of misses the point, because we think of a border, at least in the immigration case, as just sort of, here's the line, you know, keep folks here, keep folks there. But what exactly does that mean? There is no sort of hard border almost anywhere in the world. I should qualify that because I don't know everything, but I think just take the United States and its border with Mexico. People cross that border all the time. Now the question is, for what sort of purposes? And by that I mean sort of, are you coming to be a tourist? So for tourism, people coming from anywhere in the world to go to Disney World or Disneyland or whatever, People come all the time, and capitalists want that. People want to make money and have people come and visit, so cross the border, so the physical border itself, but then the idea is to they go back. Other folks have a kind of you might call it permanent residency, so people cross the border to reside in the United States, so they cross the physical border, but they have not crossed the other border. And so there's another border, which is the border what we talked about before, the citizenship. So you could be a permanent resident, live most of your life in the United States, way Aristotle did in Athens, live your entire life in the United States. You've crossed the physical border, but you've never crossed that other conceptual border to be a citizen. And so the thing about borders is they're porous. So the question isn't about sealing it up, it's not about building the wall. The question is, how do you manage these borders in an equitable manner, where you respect the moral equality of all people and the liberty of all people, and to some degree, be cognizant of keeping safety. But then there's another border, which is the border towards citizenship. So there's always at least two borders. And if I wanted to get really philosophically complex, there's actually a bunch of other borders in between. But just to keep it really simple, we have the physical border demarcating territory, and that gets crossed in all kinds of different manners and for all kinds of different reasons, and nobody would really want a hard territorial border.
Like nobody could go in or out.
Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like you're getting at, you mentioned equity and you mentioned
Liberty.
Yeah. Sounds like we're talking about some really American ideals and values here, like justice and freedom.
And I might be stepping a little bit on Professor Forrant's territory, but he might be able to explain this a little bit better. For a long time, and I would say maybe most of human history, it wasn't so much people coming in, it was people leaving. So whenever you had sort of enforcement of borders, it was usually to keep people in, because you wanted to sort of keep the labor in. Or you would straight up just banish people, but that was sort of a different issue. But the idea that you're going to prevent people from coming in is fairly new, at least in Western society, keeping people out, not letting them come in under normal circumstances. There'd be other sort of, but this idea of having, the passport system itself wasn't even sort of institutionalized fully until 1980. So you started getting early passports, but that again begins, I'm getting out of bounds a bit here because it's getting away from philosophy, so I'll let Professor Forrant say this, but for a philosopher it's pretty interesting when we start emphasizing which kinds of borders and where. And I'll pass it over to you because I'm doing a lot more.
Any final thoughts? We're about ready to wrap.
As far as borders, the idea of them being these high sort of constructs or whatever is a myth, because if you look at U.S. history, again, what I know, we're forever trying to bring people from one place in the world or another to come in and augment our workforce. And so we make no bones about bringing people in. So certainly the history of the Southwest, Southern California with Mexico is these periodic movements, particularly around wars, like the First World War or the Second World War, to be perfectly fine with bringing massive numbers of people in to do the labor. And then at the conclusion of whatever that is, trying to kick people out again. So it's not simply, again, this idea that we don't want people to be put together, or we want people to approximate the same physical space. American border policy in the 20th century, for sure, has been a policy related to labor markets more than anything else. And so that puts the lie, I think, to this idea that there are these really hard and fast rules and regs. They're as porous as the borders actually are.
Well, that's a lot to go over in the short time that we have, and hopefully we can have you both back on to continue the discussion at some point. This has been our special, and I just wanted to plug this real quick. Can you tell us about this book, Dr. Mendoza?
Well, if you're interested in the moral and political philosophy of immigration, this is it. I cover 3 areas in particular: liberty, equality, and security, and ultimately make a strong case for immigrant rights. And like I said before, I think it's important to get clear on the facts. But what's interesting about the immigration debate is you can deploy facts in all kinds of different ways. Often, what they show you is what your philosophy of immigration is. And so I give you some reasons to question it if you're a restrictionist, and I give you some some stuff to use if you're a pro-immigrant rights person.
All right. Thank you both. This has been Crossover, and maybe we'll see you again sometime.